gonna say that.
I get energetic.
Extended.
I went up to the.
I mean, hey, it'll melt, John.
Venture.
Next month.
Fairfax.
Adam and Autumn, Kelly, they did over Arkansas to watch, also, pitching, they're playing baseball started like. Where,
Is baseball ever in?
I think they were like Arkadelphia, and it was 80 degrees and it was winter.
Forecast is calling for rain Tuesday through next Sunday. Not much of it, right in the middle. It's going to be 5 degrees. Well, it rains. It's supposed to be warm, right? Okay.
I got my. I guess December to mid-December to mid-January, utility bill, and it wasn't that much. I mean, it was, but normal. This next one, next one's really gonna be pretty high.
I feel like we kept our water running for straight, just so that I don't freeze.
Who talked to me this morning?
You know, up in Alaska, they can't put pipes in the ground because of permafrost.
Johnny, the boys are in.
So,
And
because
so,
like they have to build the houses above the ground with ventilation there, because if they set a house on the ground, you would melt the permafrost and the house would sink in the ground. And they have tanks in an outdoor building that holds, the sewage, wastewater, and then they have trucks that come by and pump it out, because that building has to be deep, because they can't run sewer pipes to the ground. I'm talking like in Williamsburg, Fairbanks, further north than there. It's a whole different world up there, the way they have to live.
That makes good reason to live that.
Yeah. The whole part of the world that's at a lower latitude than that. I was up at a place called Thompson, which is northern Idaho. It's below there, and there's lots of Hispanics, Indians, Indians there. And I was inquiring about why would they go to a place that's so cold? And there's some kind of law in Canada that to get citizenship, you have to live for a certain period of time above a certain parallel. Latitude, whichever one was, left or right, east or west. And that particular city is above that parallel. And so they had to live there for 2 years before they could apply for citizenship.
But they will finally bring in.
Just gotta make sure you really want it.
Let's see.
There's nothing there but mine, a lot of people work at, big Indian reservation. And there's a lot of derelicts there.
That was the mail.
If an Indian, they call it First Nation, up there, if they misbehave, break some of the tribe's laws, they get kicked off the reservation. They move into town. And, all the drunkards and everything, so they're all derelicts in there.
So I think it must be. I'm not sure. There's a good number.
Trying to tell them we're going back to chapter 1. Since we didn't want this one.
You tell them what I told you this morning.
No.
At about, I don't know, 8 o'clock, I texted Derek and said, hey, I can't teach this morning, can you cover me? I was really just texting him to see if I need to bring in cords or anything for the TV, but I told him I'd give him at least 2 hours. Heads up next time. No, we can go and get started. I know we usually start with a video. If you've read the text already, there's not really any videos for what we're going to talk about. So we'll jump right into it. I don't really want to start this way, but I feel like we need to. Last time we were here, Blake introduced himself, and I assume like him, a lot of you guys may not know me. So I'll start with the obligatory introductions, so you know a little bit about who I am up here speaking to you. My name is Trent. My wife is Hannah, and I have a son named Abram. He's 6. He's about this tall. He's got blue glasses, so you see him running around. That's him. We've been going here for about 3 years or so. It doesn't feel quite that long, but it's been very refreshing for us to be here. And Campbell Street, I feel like, I'm not exaggerating when I say this, but it's really changed our life. And that's what we're looking for when we thought about how we wanted our son to be raised. And I thought eventually, I'm always excited to come to Campbell Street on Sundays and Wednesdays, and I thought eventually that would wear off, but it hasn't. And it's not just the worship that we enjoy, it's also the life groups, it's the city serve, it's the soup kitchen, all these things, and it's just the general environment here of Campbell Street that has just made such a big difference. And you guys are a part of that, so thank you for being who you are. I have some elders in here as well. Thank you guys for the way you lead and the culture you've created here. It really is something very special. I also thought about teaching this class. I thought I shouldn't be up there. Like, I hear you guys say comments sometimes, and you guys have been to these places that we talk about, so you guys have more of a right than me to be up here. So hopefully I'll be able to share something that one of the other scholars said that will get you thinking, like, with some engagement. I work at Freed-Hardeman. Every man wants to know what another man does. So I work at Freed-Hardeman like a lot of people here. You ever notice that when you get in a conversation with somebody, if it's man to man, it's like, hey, how you doing? I'm Trent, Derek. And maybe we talk about the weather, but within 1 or 2 questions, it goes to, what do you do? And if they're retired, it's like, well, what did you used to do? So that's how it works. I work with our graduate programs, a lot of recruiting and marketing for those, and then I also do adjunct a couple classes for the College of Business. So that's my background. That's me. I'm excited to teach this class. I'm excited to dive into it, and this text was interesting for me to study. Initially, when I read it, when Derek sent out the spreadsheet to sign up for dates, I didn't look at the text. I just looked at the dates to see when it would be available. I chose this one, and then I read it, and I was like, what are we talking about? What happened is what happened. What do we say? But there's a lot of subtle word choice that Luke uses that has a lot of meaning to it, so we'll get deeper into those. Our theme verse that we've been using, Acts 1:8, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and the ends of the earth. And our text today actually brings us to Jerusalem. We had this disclaimer a lot too. Being in this class for a couple months, it kind of seems like this class takes kind of an academic approach, and so I kind of took that in my lesson as well, where I just read the text, and then I read a bunch of commentaries, a bunch of notes, listened to a bunch of sermons on this text, and kind of compiled a bunch of research, and then try to disseminate it in a way that would be helpful. One of the books I read was N.T. Wright's The Challenge of Acts, and I know this has been mentioned a few times. In talking about these passages that we're going to be studying the next few weeks, N.T. Wright said, he's heard it said that a good novel or indeed a great play should be read 3 times. First, to discover what happens. Second, to ponder the characters and their motives. And then third, to ask bigger questions about what it all means. He says that's especially true in a passage such as Acts 21 through 24. It's so full of exciting detail that it's easy to just sit back and watch the film without really getting to the point. Now, our text today, and what we talked about last time we were here, I think 2 weeks ago, I still got us all mixed up, but last time we were here, later part of Acts 20, and then the part of the text we're talking about today. It's just kind of setting up this entrance into Jerusalem for Paul, and that's when it really just starts. It gets intense, and of course you guys know the story, you know what happens. But in scenarios like that, it's easy to just read through it, and it's detail to detail, and then it's he gets arrested, he gets it back, and then this happens, he makes a speech, and it's easy to read right through it and forget. To try to go back and wonder why the character said what they said. What did they mean by saying what they said? What's the context of what they said and why they said it? So that was a really good book, reading through to help me prepare for this class. And then I've got a few slides here from R.C. Sproul's book, You'll Be My Witnesses, The Ends of the Earth, his exposition on Acts. We'll start over here. Can you see that? We've got a few slides. If you'll read that, we'll just kind of go around, and then after this, we'll read a text, and we'll just keep going around the room to read that as well.
Accelerated crisis is a literary device commonly used by writers of fiction, particularly in mystery or adventure novels. The protagonist is faced with a severe crisis from which there seems to be no possible way of escape. This technique was used in old film serials such as The Perils of Pauline.
A damsel tied to the railroad tracks had no hope of escape as a fast-moving train bore down upon her. At that moment, the screen would fade to black with an invitation to tune in next week to see what happened. Inevitably, there was a...
You can sit down, too. What is it called?
No,
Days of Strength.
Okay.
Machine of the God.
Okay.
and a device by which the hero was miraculously rescued from certain destruction.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
A short time later, however, the hero fell into an even greater crisis. In creating an accelerated crisis, a writer plays with the emotions of the reader as the hero goes from the frying pan into the fire.
We could easily think that the literary device had been invented by Luke when he wrote the history of Paul's missionary journeys. From place to place, Paul faced one crisis after another. He was beaten with rods in one town and stoned in another.
And still another, he was cast into prison. He always managed somehow to escape at the last possible second, only to go to the next town and find himself in a worse crisis than before.
Paul has just been warned by the prophet Agabus not to go to Jerusalem because chains and imprisonment awaited him there. Paul refused to be persuaded by these dire warnings, and like Jesus before him, he set his face as a flint to go.
You guys ever read a book series or watched a TV series or a movie where that accelerated crisis plays out? You guys have any examples, anything recently that you've watched or in the past or read? I was thinking, I don't know why we watched this, but several years ago, I guess about 10 years ago, my wife and I were living in Texas, we had kids, and we were just looking for something to watch, and we watched a series of a DC comic turned a TV series called The Flash. You guys ever heard of The Flash before? And I'm not a big comic, so I didn't know the history of everything, so this was all new to me. And The Flash is a guy who's super fast, obviously, but the first villain in the first season is also super fast, and he defeats him. I thought, wow, he finally defeated him. The next season came out, and the next villain was even faster. And I was like, okay, come on. And then we finished that season. The next one, you know what the villain was? The person who was even faster. And so it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And so we stopped watching after that. It's like, this is all it's going to be. People are just getting faster. I know what's going to happen. Right. That's fiction. This is Paul's life. Like, it just seems like one thing after the other. And as I've been studying in this class and as I researched this, sometimes you just have to wonder, like, what was going through Paul's mind? Like, was there ever a point where it was like, God, I'm doing my best, but it seems like you're putting up a lot of roadblocks, and it's really challenging. And there's moments there, too, where he's grateful for the support of the churches that he gets and those kind of things. But even here in this text, as we're going to read 2 weeks ago, early in chapter 20, or later in chapter 20, Agabus, a prophet, tells Paul, he takes Paul's belt and ties it around his hands and his feet and says, the Holy Spirit says this is what's going to happen to you if you go. And even before that, people were still saying, please don't go to Jerusalem, it's not safe for you there. And he still goes. And if I were Paul, I'd almost feel like, well, is the Holy Spirit telling me not to go, should not go? But he is so determined on going that he does. Again, I just thought that point about the accelerated crisis was really interesting. I don't know how you view Paul. Maybe you view him differently now that you've been studying him for the past year or so. But when I thought about Paul, up until I started researching and started studying this class, I had a certain view of Paul that was very fire and brimstone type preacher. I don't know why I thought that. Maybe just the way he talks to some people, the seriousness with which he carried out his ministry. I don't know why I had that notion of Paul, but I did. And when I read through the last portion of chapter 20 and into 21, people were weeping when he left them. You read in chapter 20, that was after the prophet warned him what would happen, and he left the area. It says they were weeping. And then before that, when he was living in another town, the wives and the children and all the disciples followed him to the port to pray with him on the beach before he left. And I just thought, you don't have those types of relationships. People don't weep when you leave. If you're just kind of, you like empathy, you're all just about preaching. And so this has really changed my view of Paul, and the type of person he was, especially for these Gentile Christians, but also for these Jewish Christians.
Your portrayal that you use there is of an old man. I perceive Paul to be maybe in his 40s.
Yeah, I don't know. I tried to find some pictures online, and I thought about this because I know Scott always liked to use AI, and you like to use pictures, and so I tried to use later. I'll use AI that it's painted pictures, so it's like a merge of what you guys use. Yeah, you Google Paul, and it's just a mixture of pages and portraits and paintings. So I don't know. Maybe all the shipwrecks and stuff made him grow gray hair a lot earlier than he normally would have. I don't know. Okay. Oh, yes. I also wanted to point out some of these people that Paul would have interacted with, especially in our text, but later on as well, probably knew him as Saul. Right? Some of them probably did. Some of the early disciples knew him as the man who used to persecute them. And now when he goes to these congregations and he talks to these people, they weep when he leaves. And so Paul talks a lot about the grace of God. And that made me think, who better to talk about the grace of God than this man? And for me, that shed some light on why he was so intentional and just headstrong in doing what he felt like the Lord was calling him to do, because he experienced the grace that he felt like was undeserved for what he had done. And so it changed the way he lives, and I think the same could be true for us as well. So we're going to read Acts 21, 15 through 26. We'll read it together. Wherever we stopped at, we can pick back up, and then we'll kind of go verse by verse and talk about the text.
After this, we started on our way up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea accompanied us and brought us to the home of Manasseh, where we were to stay. He was a man from Cyprus and one of the early disciples.
When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry.
When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs."
I just want to say, Trey, thank you for the side of the letter.
What shall we do? They will come certainly hear that you, they will certainly hear that you have come. So do what we tell you. So do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow.
Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses, so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law.
As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality.
The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end, and the offerings would be bring to them.
Okay. What did you notice? And I will say, I don't know who made the comment about the text size. I wear contacts, and I've reached the age now to where, like, if I'm reading the text on this Bible, I also take my glasses and put them on, even with my contacts, so I can see them. So I've reached that stage early. So I get what you're going through there. Made it so you guys could read it. What'd you notice about the text?
Well, it's hard to know if, this is a strange, challenging passage, because Paul is out there teaching that you're not under the law anymore. And James is telling him, hey, this was true, but let's prove that it's not true. And Paul doesn't object, he just does it.
I think the difference there is he says you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles. So it's not that he's teaching everybody. He's telling the Gentiles you don't have to keep the law. But that would be hard if you were a Jew to just stop. Like, I don't have to keep Passover. Well, that's still part of my heritage, and I'm there to take it.
We're going to talk a lot about that, about the Jews having their identity versus this new faith that they have. Yeah.
And James says that all these Jews, these believers, are zealous for the law. So they have to
He gave God the credit. He was quick to do that.
I thought it was interesting when it said he gave a report of the good things going on in his ministry to the Gentiles, and so they praised God, and then they immediately go into, okay, about these Jews, though, like almost dismissive of, which they weren't. It's easy to gloss over that. Who knows what was in, and they praised God. That could have been 15 minutes talking about great power for him. But when you read the text fast, I think you're right with saying you kind of gloss over that.
Well, with the coming of the new covenant, it was a fulfillment of the old covenant. So it was a continuation of the law. The old law didn't disappear, it was fulfilled, which meant that what was in the old law was replaced by the new law. Yet you can see how the Jews would not grasp all of that immediately, and if they hear what is being taught, just like in our politics today, it can become distorted what someone actually meant from what they actually said, and perceive that they're teaching something that's different.
Yeah, and it's also not just their religion, but their identity, right? This is much more than just what they believe, it's how they live for these Jewish Christians. Okay.
One other thing I did notice is that when he was talking about converting the Jews amongst the Gentiles, he said that they were zealous for the law. And then when in Jerusalem, when they said, well, tell the Gentiles to do these 4 things. And so you had a dichotomy of practices. The Gentiles were, he didn't tell the Gentiles to do what the Jews were doing. He said these 4 things. Yeah. And that sort of stuff. So there was, it was acceptable for there to be different practices there.
Yeah. Well, that's basically my lesson, what you guys have been saying. Is that, and there's this tension there, right, between these Gentile Christians and what they're required to do and don't have to do, and then these Jewish Christians and what they feel like they should still do. And that tension is there a lot in Acts, but especially here it heats up as Paul goes to Jerusalem for the second time.
Well, this gave a methodology for them to actually fellowship with one another without feeling like they're with unclean people or people that they've been taught not to associate with.
Okay. Acts 21:15 says, after this, Luke says, got ready and went up to Jerusalem. I couldn't find a map. Spoiler alert. Later on, Acts 23, Paul actually gets sent from Jerusalem back to Caesarea to meet with Governor Felix. And this is that route. I couldn't find one from Caesarea to Jerusalem. I assume it's much the same. They're getting ready to go about 64 miles, mostly uphill, to Jerusalem. And this Greek word that they use, we got ready, is that. I'm not going to try to say it. But it just denotes packing bags, those kinds of things. But one scholar I was reading suggested they were getting ready physically, obviously packing their horse or their donkey, whatever they used to travel with, but also mentally. For me, it kind of, when that scholar said that, it kind of put me in the mindset of almost Gethsemane, not the same intensity, but, you know, it's just kind of eerie. They know what's about to happen. Agabus has already said you're going to be bound up if you go to Jerusalem. That's a prophecy that's been said multiple times already. And so I imagine as they're packing up, they're getting their things ready, but also their mind ready. Not sure exactly what's going to happen, but knowing that it's not going to be easy, and knowing that trial or imprisonment, something bad awaits them. And then verse 16, some of the disciples from Caesarea accompanied us and brought us to the home of Mnason, where we were to stay. Okay, so this character is important. That word, his name Mnason, was potentially a Hellenized form of his name Manasseh. As such, he was probably a Hellenistic Jew. What does that mean, to be a Hellenistic Jew?
They were very, very steeped into Greek culture.
Yeah. So it was someone who held the Jewish faith, but was also steeped in Greek culture, language, customs, that kind of stuff. So it makes sense that since Paul has some Gentile companions with him, and needs a place to stay, that he would stay with somebody like Mnason. He's not going to go stay with a Jewish Christian with these Gentile Christians with him. So him hosting this crew of people is a big deal, not just because he's a Jew and these are Gentile Christians as well, but also we think that Pentecost was going on. Earlier, a couple chapters ago, Acts 20, I think, maybe earlier than that, 17, Paul mentioned wanting to get to Jerusalem before Pentecost. And several of the things highlight that. So we think Pentecost is going on. And so lodging was not going to be abundant in or around Jerusalem during this time because you have so many people coming into town. I tried to think what the equivalent of this would be. You know, you have a big advance of people coming to town. I thought of lectures, trying to find somewhere to stay in Henderson with free Hardeman lectures. And so it's interesting that they don't really stay in Jerusalem. It appears that Mnason lives just outside of Jerusalem. And so they stay here with him first. And then the next day they go into Jerusalem, and where they meet with Paul, where Paul and his companions meet with James and the other elders there. And it's likely that when he meets with them this time, he's detailing the second and third missionary journeys. In Acts 15, he already came to Jerusalem and met with them once, and that's when he came to talk about this dispute among the Gentiles to be circumcised. And again, they reiterate in this text, they don't have to be circumcised, but here's what they do have to do, abstain from these things. And so it's likely just detailing those journeys, and it marks the end of his 3 missionary journeys. And so it's just crazy to think about. You guys have been going over everything that leads up to this for Paul, thousands of miles and all these years, and it leads to here. Those journeys are about to be over, and he's going to go into Jerusalem, and things pick up and get really intense. And I was talking to my wife about it last night. It gets really intense, and then it just ends. Like the way Acts, like it just ends. It doesn't know if there's any kind of resolution to it. So Paul details his ministry among the Gentiles. When they heard this, they praised God, and they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for for the law. I'm not going to talk much about this. Before we go on here, we've talked in the past about how Luke, it seems he attempts to bring Paul's status up with other heroes of faith. We've talked about that. Eutychus falling out and raising from the dead. Mike talked about that, about some similarities between Jesus. And I just thought it was interesting. You know, Luke talks about Jesus being, having his, what did he say? Luke 9:51, Jesus was determined to go to Jerusalem. Luke also wrote about Paul that he was determined to go to Jerusalem. So we just keep seeing these parallels of Paul with these other figures of faith. Okay, so Paul details his journeys to these elders here. And I find it interesting that he uses this word here, the Greek word for thousands here. I took Greek, I was a Bible major at Greek, but that was 10 years ago, so I'm not going to try to pretend like I know how to pronounce these words. But the word that he used for thousands here denotes a unit of 10,000. And so there's another word, another Greek word that is thousands, like single digits, thousands, 1, 2, 3,000. But he uses the word tens of thousands, the elder does. And so I don't think he's trying to communicate, you know, he took a census and there's 10,000 here, but I think he's trying to communicate, look, you've been doing this ministry among the Gentiles, and it's wildly successful. We're so grateful for it, but also know that this is a movement among Jews as well. That Christianity is growing, that the gospel is being told to the Jews as well, and it's growing here too. And so that's great, but it also spells more trouble for Paul, because he's not a very popular man with the Jewish Christians. And then, as you guys have pointed out, James, we think, is the one that we're talking to, another one. All of them are zealous for the law. And I find that word choice interesting, just reading this without looking what any of the scholars say or commentaries. I thought, why would he say zealous for the law? He's talking about the Jews who have believed in Christ, and they're zealous for the law. Why did he say zealous for the faith? Zealous for other language they use for this new covenant, for Jesus, for the gospel, but he says they're zealous for the law. And so this is where we start talking about, you can hold these two things can be true, that you can have the Jews believe this and practice this, and Gentiles can believe this and practice this, and both of those can be okay as long as we know where salvation really comes from. And like you mentioned, this guy a couple weeks ago, he said these believers were zealous for the law, which he thinks Acts seems to understand in mostly an honorable way. It's a good thing. Paul himself is ready to show solidarity with his people this way. We just read that he's going to partake in these vows with these men. Paul was not against Jewish people honoring the law. He was against imposing it on Gentiles as a condition for being right with God, or some kind of elevated believer. So Paul is saying, look, it's all right if you want to keep your Jewish customs, but don't think that you're elevated, that you're better in the sight of God because you keep these customs. The Gentile believers don't have to observe these feast days and observe all these other things to be a believer. What matters, Paul talks about in other areas, is your relationship with God and what you believe about Jesus, the Messiah. Okay, we go on, and the elder is saying, all these Jewish Christians coming from outside of Jerusalem and inside of Jerusalem, they've been informed that you teach, well, I guess it's really more the Jews who live inside Jerusalem. They've heard that you teach the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, tell them not to circumcise their children or live according to their customs. Again, the word choice, when you just read this, like, okay, this is what he said. This word here, to turn away from, is the Greek word apostasia. What does that word sound like? Apostasia. Like what? Apostasy. What's an apostate? Someone who renounces a religious or political belief. Like they held and they renounce it. I'm totally against it. So I don't know if this is just Luke writing this down and putting that word, if the elder used that word, but these Jewish Christians in Jerusalem picture Paul as an apostate. This is not just, Paul has different beliefs on different texts, or he interprets the law different ways. they think he's an apostate. This is a big deal for how they view Paul. They think he's leading the Jews into religious betrayal of Moses. It's a big deal. And that's one of the reasons why the situation is so volatile. And then he says, all the Jews who live among the Gentiles. So Paul is accused of influencing these diaspora Jews, so the Jews who live outside of Jerusalem. There was already a great concern among Jews in Jerusalem, Jewish Christians and Jews, that those that live outside of Jerusalem are being influenced too much by Gentile culture against Hellenistic Jews. They were worried about that, about them leaving their Jewish faith and their Jewish customs. And so here comes along Paul, who supposedly is telling these Jews who they're already worried about, you can forsake Moses, you can forsake the customs, which is technically true. You don't have to anymore. But they think he's explicitly telling the Jews, you can't do those things. And like with a lot of rumors, there's an element of truth here, right? He is telling the Gentiles, you don't have to do those things. But we never see him telling the Jews or Jewish Christians specifically that they don't have to do those things anymore. So Paul is really saying no one is justified by the law. Since circumcision is not determined salvation. There's 2 verses, but there's several places where Paul mentions that. But what he's not doing is seeking to make Jews abandon their heritage. Remember, this is much more than just their religion. This is their entire identity. This is their culture. This is their way of life. And so he's not just saying, okay, you're a believer now, you got to forget everything and don't practice all those customs that you hold so dear anymore. He's not saying that. He's not telling Jewish Christians they're sinning by keeping the customs. He's not saying it's a new law now and you can't do any of that stuff anymore. It's a sin. He's not saying that. And he's not teaching them to forsake Moses, their leader, their hero in their eyes.
When I read this, I think back to a movie, a musical that came out probably before you were born, called Fiddler on the Roof. And how the old patriarch, I think his name was Tevye, maybe, sang a song called Tradition, that his children were leaving the old traditions, and it was, he was complaining to God, what does he do now that his children won't follow the old Jewish traditions?
If I heard Paul talk to Peter in Galatians, I would have thought the same thing. I mean, I would have thought, well, Paul's telling us we don't need the law. So it's a bad.
It reminds me of that game, I think it's called Telephone. The kids play, you sit in a circle and like, I would whisper to Derek a sentence, a long enough sentence, and he would try to whisper it to you, and then we get back around to the original person, and you would try to see how close it was. Because if you say, long enough sentence or paragraph or story, things are going to get misconstrued or said a different way by the time it gets around. So sometimes I wonder, was that it too? Did a Jewish Christian hear Paul talk to the Gentiles and say, circumcision doesn't mean anything? I mean, he said that before. And then he goes back and says, hey, Paul is saying, forsake Moses because circumcision doesn't mean anything. And like, it can get around that way. So you can see, and the situation was already volatile, right? They were already concerned that these Jews living with the Gentiles were already going to forsake the faith. And now they just see Paul as expediting that process. So the solution the elders have, basically there's 4 men here who they are taking what we assume is a Nazirite vow. They suggest, Paul, why don't you take these men, you participate with them, you don't do the Nazirite vow, obviously because they're already declared they're doing that, but take these men and join them in these purification rites and pay their expenses so they can complete this vow. And I think it's interesting, I don't know about you, and again, I wasn't living in this context, so maybe this is unreasonable to think, but if I was Paul, I feel like I just want to say, well, can I just, let's go to the temple, kind of just tell them not what I mean. Here's what I mean. But maybe the situation was so volatile that if he were to even hold a hearing or want to preach a sermon, they just wouldn't take it. So the elders say, if people see you, Jewish Christians see you participating in these customs, our Jewish customs, they'll know the things that are being said about you are not true. So that's their proposal, and that's what they do. What do we know? Again, we assume that they're taking a Nazirite vow, hence the long hair. What do we know about Nazirite vows?
cut your hair, don't drink any wine, alcoholic beverages.
Don't touch dead bodies or.
So I went to number 6. I'm a very process-oriented person. I like checklists, I like to know everything detail. I might have liked the talk. I don't know, you know exactly what you're supposed to do. There's no gray area. But I went to number 6 and said, okay, if I wanted to do the Nazarite vow, what would that look like? So Nazarite vows were completely voluntary. They were not required. But if you did do it, there were certain steps you had to take in certain orders and certain things. And so I went to number 6, and here's what you have to do. It's a vow of separation, is what they call it. You dedicate yourself to God. Okay, so it's voluntary, but if you decide to do it, abstain from wine and other fermented drink, abstain from vinegar made from wine, abstain from grape juice, grapes or raisins, abstain from anything that comes from the grapevine, including seeds and skins, and no razor must be used on the head during the time of the vow. Must not go near a dead body. And there's also a section there that talks about if your mother or your father or your brother or sister dies, sorry, not going to the funeral. There's also a section there like, well, if you're standing there and a dead person falls right beside you, here's what you're supposed to do. But we're just going to pretend that none of this happened for them. So they abstained from all those things. When the time of separation is over, so when that is done, and Numbers points out that there's no certain, it's not time bound. Some people do it for a couple of weeks, some people do it for months, some people do it for years, some people try to choose to do it for a lifetime. But whenever you decide that period is over, here's what you're to do. You're to be brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and you're to present to the priest to present to the Lord a 1-year-old male lamb without defect for a burnt offering, a 1-year-old ewe lamb without defect for a sin offering, a ram without defect for a fellowship offering, and grain offerings and drink offerings. Also, you're to bring a basket of bread made without yeast, and cakes made of fine flour mixed with oil, and then wafers spread with oil. You give all that to the priest, and he'll present it to the Lord. And then, at the entrance of the tent of meeting, they're to cut their hair. And then they're supposed to take the hair and put it into the fire that was for the fellowship offering. And this was the craziest part that I didn't know. After all of that, the priest is to take a boiled shoulder of the ram, a cake and a wafer from the basket, and wave them before the Lord as a wave offering. Number one, just trying to picture, a priest having like a shoulder of a ram and a wafer and a cake and trying to wave it. But then I just think, man, I'm so glad that under this new covenant, we don't have to do this. Like if we want to dedicate ourselves to the Lord, if we want to renew our commitment to Him, this is not required. We have direct access. We don't have to go through a priest. We don't have to do all these offerings, these kinds of things. The offering has already been made, and we have direct access to Him. So, what is Paul's role in this? It said participate in the purification rites. What does that look like? Well, here's a last name, Richard Longenecker. How'd you like to have that? He's a scholar, and he said, coming from abroad, here's what Paul would have had to do. He would have had to regain ceremonial purity by a 7-day ritual purification. The ritual included reporting to one of the priests and being sprinkled with water of atonement on the 3rd and 7th days. He must also report to the priest at the start of the 7 days of purification, inform them that he was providing the funds for the offering of 4 men, and then return to the temple at regular intervals during the weeks for the appropriate rites. So this wasn't just like, hey, Paul, why don't you go with them and encourage them and support them in their vow. This cost him money, this cost him time, inconvenience, all while he knew I don't really have to do this to be right with God, but I'm going to do it. Anyways, so this makes me think of what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 9. Do you remember what that verse says?
Become all things to all men.
Yeah. I become a Jew to Jews. And that is a lot of self-constraint. Like in my mind, to be able to say, I know this is not what saves you. This is not what we're about anymore. But out of respect for these Jewish Christians who don't like him, who's spreading lies about him, knowingly or not, I'm going to become a Jew to Jews so that by all means I might save some of them. So this isn't addressing what Paul believes. It's just addressing what people think Paul believes. And this is the solution. Participate in these rites with him at a personal cost of both time and money. Okay, and then this was just reaffirming, in Acts 15, last time Paul was in Jerusalem, they had a discussion about the Gentiles and circumcision. So they're just reaffirming, hey, we still, same thing for the Gentiles, wherever you're going. They don't have to participate in these customs, be circumcised, but they do have to do this. I had a quote from Michael Heiser, but I'll skip it for time. Okay. Paul doesn't seem to protest these elders' decisions at all. I think there's a lot of respect for the elders. Also coming to mind is that 1 Corinthians 9 passage, the Jew just does it. Okay, that's the plan. That's what I'll do. I'll take these men. I'll participate in the purification rites. I'll help them with their vows. These are purposeful in that. And when I think about this Nazirite vow, what we just talked about, all the sacrifice, ram, lambs, all the sacrifice involved in that. Paul is leading these men to the temple, and perhaps he's thinking about the Torah, these different rhythms of worship that they had, these festivals, also thinking about the amount of sacrifice that the Torah required. And so these men, likely also Jewish Christians, and Paul himself a Christian, going to the temple to participate in this vow, this Nazirite vow, something from the Torah, all while knowing that the ultimate sacrifice has already been made. Jesus has already died. There's no more requirement for a lamb. There's no more requirement for a ram to be sacrificed. You don't have to do these things, but I'll do it anyway. Because the church was that important to Paul. Also put this picture here. Initially I said, hey, can you do a picture for Acts 21, verse 26, and have Paul with the 4 men walking to the temple. And have them just kind of walking straight face. But then I thought, based on what we talked about earlier, about how much people loved Paul, and how they would weep when he would leave, it's hard for deep relationships with that to form without there being laughter. Right? That's a great way to strengthen bonds and relationships. And so it's helpful for me to see something like this. And this is AI, obviously we don't know what Paul and these men look like, but it's helpful for me to see, because sometimes I think of Paul as this ethereal, some random figure. I don't think of him as human. And so it's helpful for me to see him as a human with feelings and emotions and thoughts and complexities that he had to deal with as a leader. And he's holding all of that together the best that he can. Memories of being shipwrecked, all these things for the purpose of advancing the gospel. So I hope this in some way helped humanize Paul a little bit for you. It did for me, certainly. And after this, we're going to see Paul go into the temple, and some Jewish Christians from Asia are going to come and stir up some trouble. So I'm not sure what that's going to be, but it's going to start escalating really quickly. So 2 things. We won't discuss this, but just something to carry with you. God's mission advances through grace, even in tensions, misunderstandings, and risk. What that looks like for us today. And then faithful leaders, like Paul, often have to navigate times of extreme complexity. Life is not always black and white, a lot of gray, a lot of complexities, as we see here as well. So, any final thoughts? Thank you, guys.
So your notes are on it? So your notes. There's some nice words. I don't know. Usually when I,
Years on DoorDash.
I remember when, but I was double on, yeah,
Yeah.
I wasn't gonna be able to do that. Tuesday, I get it, the small majority of the time, but I didn't know you could do garage.
not a lot of,
But it's a good job.
I'm not used to how to set the moon.
Sometimes I want to be like,
I might try to trick you into something.
oh,
It does, it helps.
Do the work.
Patience.
You didn't drive truck.
Yeah, you do it, yeah, when I redid the calendar, it wasn't the last day of the week. Because you wanted to, I was going to do that, but then these 2 weeks off, like, the meeting might be on so, yeah, you're okay with that. Forget the Bible. Perhaps in my company,
Well, every winter I get shit.
that looks like,
Turn right.
it's like every year at a time, you know, some freebie thing.
You get that, legislation doing mortgage. Leaders credit union.
I have, well, they didn't give up.
Yeah.
I make a payment to leaders every month, and I never got a fine.
Yeah, so I'm worried about that, I'm worried about that, but.
So y'all, yeah, and when we bought it, y'all were still living up there. Because y'all used to like,
Right now.
yeah, it was a
Yeah,
stroke.
I just got a poll and I was just.
But you weren't going to
Chill,
campus?
yeah.
Okay, I couldn't hear you said that this morning, I was like, you've been at our house for 6 years now.
Oh,
Yeah, oh, no, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It seems so.
I just did it from the edge, pop it up, toss it to the side.
Cool.
Yeah, it was, yes, it was. Well, I'm glad we're fitting lose electricity or anything. We had some friends that, in Nashville that volunteered for us.
I'll let the car show you out at the, Keith.
Well, they had,
See, I would love that, and the current location, I thought would be a great spot for a cold roast. The current Chick-fil-A. Right. And I've heard it's gonna be a bank. Like, once that's torn down, it's gonna be a bank, and I'm just like, oh, man.
But we've been talking with them,
Culver's would be great.
and they need one of the partners has to be an owner operator. So Brandon and I have been talking, and we're not who we can get. We need to find somebody who works like in the Chick-fil-A system and get them to
Run it well.
get the right people, and make that work. Would that be something you'd be interested in? But it'd be a long-term career kind of thing.
Not something I've ever considered before. So off the top of my head, I'd probably say no, because, my main goal with where I'm going with my career, at least for now, I mean, it could all change. I'm sure you've made adjustments in your career. But, Chick-fil-A for me was really supposed to be a temporary thing, because I worked at Bramwood Group. And decided that even working there, and I love, Jason and Don, I don't know how well you know the Bramwoods, but, I just wanted to work at a more manageable pace in my life, because I was a designer there, and it was just so many projects coming in all the time, and I was like working late into the night on stuff, and I just thought, how am I gonna do this to my wife and future kids forever? And so, I thought, I'm gonna work somewhere to kind of get through the non-compete time, which is 6 months. I'm coming up on that in a month. And then, I'm gonna, start working on my own graphic design, marketing stuff.
Gotcha.
Not really even to compete with them, because I have no desire to do that. I love what they do. But just to kind of help some like small businesses with their marketing. And so, anyway, I'm working toward that, and it is gonna